The morning fog hung thick over the French countryside near Arracourt on September 19, 1944. Lieutenant Edwin Leiper, commander of an M18 Hellcat platoon with Company C, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, peered through the mist, his visibility reduced to barely 30 feet. Then, emerging from the grey veil like a ghost materializing from smoke, came the unmistakable silhouette of a gun muzzle. German Panther tank, 30 feet away. In that frozen instant, Leiper faced a mathematical certainty that defined American armored warfare in 1944. His Hellcat, capable of 55 miles per hour, mounted armor barely half an inch thick, scarcely more protection than the sheet metal on a Buick sedan. The Panther ahead possessed frontal armor 4 inches thick at angles that could deflect almost any American shell. In a static slugging match, the German tank would vaporize the Hellcat with a single round, but Leiper didn't plan to be there when that round arrived. Within 5 minutes, his platoon had destroyed 5 German tanks from the 113th Panzer Brigade. 1 Hellcat lost. The platoon pushed forward, firing and displacing, hitting and vanishing. By the time the guns fell silent, 10 more German tanks burned in the fields around Rechicourt-la-Petite, 2 more Hellcats destroyed. 1 American tank destroyer, commanded by Sergeant Henry Hartmann, accounted for 6 Panthers alone, most of them knocked out while the German crews were still trying to locate where the impossibly fast American vehicle had disappeared to. This was the revolution that German tank commanders had laughed at when they first learned about it. American tank destroyers that refused to fight, that appeared like lightning and vanished like smoke, that moved so fast German gunners couldn't track them. The concept violated every principle of armored warfare the Wehrmacht held sacred. You stood your ground. You absorbed punishment with thick armor. You traded blows until the enemy broke. The Americans had written a different playbook entirely. If you're enjoying this deep dive into the story, hit the subscribe button and let us know in the comments from where in the world you are watching from today. The story of why American tank destroyers started firing, then running at 55 miles per hour, begins not on the battlefields of France, but in the smoking ruins of another country's catastrophic defeat. May 1940. France, the nation that possessed more tanks than Nazi Germany, the army that boasted the world's most powerful armored vehicles, collapsed in 6 weeks. American military observers watched in horror as German panzer divisions punched through French defensive lines, raced to the English Channel, and turned what should have been a protracted war into a lightning victory. The speed of France's defeat shattered fundamental assumptions about modern warfare. American planners had believed that defensive positions, properly prepared and supported by artillery, could contain armored breakthroughs. The fall of France proved them catastrophically wrong. German tank columns didn't stop at defensive lines. They bypassed them, drove deep into the rear areas, cut supply lines, captured headquarters, and created chaos that dissolved organized resistance before reserves could respond. Lieutenant Colonel Andrew Davis Bruce, studying these operations from Washington, recognized a terrifying pattern. The decisive factor wasn't the quality of individual tanks or the bravery of individual crews. It was operational tempo. German armoured formations moved faster than their opponents could react. By the time French commanders identified a breakthrough and dispatched reserves to seal it, German panzers had already driven 20 miles deeper into French territory. This created a doctrinal crisis for the United States Army. America in 1940 possessed exactly 0 modern tanks suitable for European warfare. The M2 light tank, barely 10 tons, and armed with a 37mm gun, couldn't penetrate German armor and couldn't survive German fire. Building an armored force from nothing would take years. Building one capable of matching German quality would take even longer. The question facing American planners wasn't whether American tanks could beat German tanks in combat. The question was how to prevent German tanks from doing to America what they had done to France. On August 8, 1941, 4 months before Pearl Harbor, General Leslie McNair issued a directive that would shape American armored warfare for the entire war. Rather than attempt to match German tank quality, rather than build heavier, more powerful, more expensive tanks to fight German panzers head-on, America would create a specialized force of tank destroyers, highly mobile, lightly armored, mounting powerful guns. These units would be held in reserve, concentrated at corps and army level, ready to rush to any point where German armor threatened to break through. The philosophy was elegant in its simplicity. You didn't need to be everywhere if you could get anywhere fast enough. A tank destroyer that could travel at 40 miles per hour could reach a threatened sector in half the time of a traditional tank. Speed became armor. Mobility became protection. The ability to choose when and where to fight became more valuable than the ability to absorb punishment when the enemy chose the battlefield. This represented a fundamental rejection of European armored warfare philosophy. British tanks emphasized armor protection and infantry support. Soviet tanks prioritized reliability and mass production, built to overwhelm through numbers. German tanks combined firepower and armor in increasingly heavy designs, from the Panzer IV to the Tiger to the Panther. Each of these approaches accepted that tanks would take hits in combat and needed protection to survive. The American tank destroyer doctrine said something radically different. The best armor is not being there when the enemy shoots back. A Tiger tank, with its massive 88mm gun and frontal armor up to 7 inches thick, could survive multiple hits from American 76mm guns. But a Tiger could only be in one place at a time, could only aim its gun in one direction, could only fire so many rounds per minute. A Hellcat couldn't survive a single hit from a Tiger, but it could be in 3 different positions in the time it took a Tiger to traverse its turret. Field Manual 18-5, published in June 1942, codified this doctrine with remarkable clarity. There is but one objective of tank destroyer units, this being plainly inferred by their designation. It is the destruction of hostile tanks. The manual emphasized offensive spirit, aggressive action, and above all, mobility. Tank destroyers were not to be distributed piecemeal along defensive lines. They were to be concentrated as complete battalions, rushed to threatened points, used to envelope enemy armor in coordinated attacks, then withdrawn before German forces could respond. The training that accompanied this doctrine was revolutionary. Traditional tank crews learned to hold positions, to provide supporting fire for infantry, to advance methodically while maintaining unit cohesion. Tank destroyer crews learned something entirely different. Find a hull-down position with good sight lines and multiple escape routes. Identify enemy armor. Fire 2, maybe 3 shots maximum. Then disappear before return fire arrives. Never stay in one place. Never fight fair. Never give the enemy time to coordinate a response. This placed extraordinary demands on crew training and unit coordination. A tank destroyer crew had to spot enemy armor before being spotted themselves. They had to estimate range accurately under combat stress, often without time for ranging shots. They had to hit with their first rounds, because firing more than a few shots from one position meant German artillery would zero in on their muzzle flashes. And they had to move immediately after firing, often through terrain they'd only scouted minutes earlier, driving at speeds that would shake conventional tanks apart. The vehicles designed to execute this doctrine reflected its priorities with brutal clarity. The M10 Wolverine, introduced in 1942, mounted a 3-inch gun on a modified Sherman chassis. It could penetrate most German armor at combat ranges and could reach speeds of 30 miles per hour. But Lieutenant Colonel Bruce wanted something faster, something that could truly embody the hit-and-run philosophy at its core. The answer came from an unlikely source. Buick, the luxury automobile manufacturer, had been converted to war production like most of American industry. In 1942, Buick engineers received specifications that seemed impossible. Design a tank destroyer that weighs no more than 20 tons, mount a 76mm gun, achieve road speeds of at least 50 miles per hour, and do it fast, because American soldiers were already dying in North Africa facing German tanks their weapons couldn't penetrate. The engineering team, led by designs from Harley Earl's Styling Division and J. Edward Hull's Military Specifications Group, started with a radical premise: strip away everything that doesn't contribute to speed or firepower. The Continental R975 radial engine, the same power plant used in M4 Sherman tanks, could generate 400 horsepower. In a Sherman weighing 33 tons, that provided adequate mobility. But what if you mated that engine to a vehicle weighing only 18 tons? The result was a power-to-weight ratio unprecedented in American armor, 25 horsepower per ton. For comparison, a Sherman managed 14 horsepower per ton. A German Panther, with its massive Maybach engine, achieved only 12 horsepower per ton. The Hellcat would be faster than any tracked vehicle in the war, capable of speeds that seemed impossible for a machine rolling on treads rather than wheels. But speed alone wouldn't kill German tanks. The Hellcat needed a weapon, and the 76mm M1A1 gun fit perfectly. This wasn't the short-barreled version mounted on early Shermans. This was a high-velocity weapon capable of penetrating 88mm of armor at 1,000 yards. Against a Panther's side armor, thinner than its frontal plate, the Hellcat's gun could achieve kills at ranges beyond which the Panther could effectively return fire if the Hellcat crew got into position properly. The compromises required to achieve this performance were stark and controversial. Armor thickness, half an inch on most surfaces, barely enough to stop rifle-caliber machine gun rounds. Artillery splinters would punch through it like paper. The open-top turret left crews exposed to airburst artillery, grenades, small arms fire from elevated positions, and the elements, rain, snow, summer heat, all of it poured directly onto the crew. The suspension system, while providing remarkable stability at high speed, was delicate compared to the robust designs used on Soviet tanks. Critics within the army called the design a death trap. Some tank destroyer battalions, upon receiving their first Hellcats, requested that the vehicles be replaced with more heavily armoured M10s or the forthcoming M36 Jackson. The complaints weren't unfounded. A crew in a Hellcat knew that a single hit from a German 75mm gun, let alone an 88mm round, meant instant death. There would be no wounded survivors climbing from damaged vehicles. There would be fire and smoke and silence. But the engineers at Buick weren't designing a vehicle to take hits. They were designing one that would never get hit in the first place. Every component choice reflected this philosophy. The Torquematic automatic transmission allowed drivers to focus on maneuvering rather than shifting gears during combat. The torsion bar suspension could absorb incredible punishment while maintaining stability at speeds where other tracked vehicles would vibrate themselves to pieces. The open-top turret, while leaving crews exposed, provided superior situational awareness and allowed crews to escape instantly if their vehicle was hit. The first M18 Hellcats rolled off production lines in July 1943. By October, the 630th Tank Destroyer Battalion had converted entirely to the new vehicle. Their training regimen differed fundamentally from that of conventional tank units. While Sherman crews learned to advance in formation, providing mutual support, Hellcat crews learned to operate independently, exploiting terrain, appearing where unexpected. Script continues in next response due to length. The 630th trained relentlessly on one core principle that would define Hellcat operations throughout the war. Shoot and scoot. The phrase itself captured the entire doctrine in 3 syllables. Identify targets from concealment. Move rapidly to a firing position. Engage with maximum firepower. Then disappear before the enemy can respond. Never trade shots. Never hold ground. Never fight on the enemy's terms. This required a complete rethinking of armoured combat psychology. Traditional tank warfare taught crews that armour provided protection, that staying in position and returning fire was how you survived. The Hellcat doctrine taught the opposite. Your protection is movement. Your survival depends on being somewhere else when the enemy fires back. Stay still and you die. Fight fair and you die. Give the enemy time to coordinate a response and you die. Training exercises reinforced these lessons with brutal clarity. Hellcat platoons practiced, identifying hull-down positions, mapping escape routes, coordinating fire so multiple vehicles could engage simultaneously then withdraw in different directions. They learned to read terrain at high speed, identifying which routes could support 30-ton vehicles traveling at 40 miles per hour. They practiced emergency maneuvers, the kind of violent turns and rapid accelerations that would throw crew members around the fighting compartment but might mean the difference between life and death. The psychological pressure this placed on crews cannot be overstated. A Sherman crew, protected by armor, could make mistakes and potentially survive. A Hellcat crew couldn't. Every decision had to be correct, every shot had to count, every movement had to be faster than the enemy expected. This demanded not just technical proficiency, but mental toughness, the ability to function under pressure, knowing that a single error meant death for the entire crew. When the first Hellcats arrived in Europe in June 1944, they carried with them a doctrine that had never been tested against the German armoured forces it was designed to defeat. American tank destroyer units had fought in North Africa and Italy, but always with the slower M10 Wolverines, and rarely in the massed battalion formations that doctrine called for. The Hellcat represented both the perfection of tank destroyer philosophy and its greatest test. German intelligence officers, examining captured documents and interrogating prisoners, learned about these new American vehicles. Tank destroyers that weighed less than 20 tons but claimed speeds exceeding 50 miles per hour. The German reaction was skepticism bordering on mockery. Such a vehicle would be unstable, they reasoned. Its thin armor would make it useless in combat. Its light weight meant it couldn't mount a weapon powerful enough to threaten German armor effectively. If the Americans were fielding such vehicles, it suggested desperation rather than innovation. This intelligence assessment would prove to be one of the most catastrophic underestimations of the entire war. The Germans understood armor protection. They understood firepower. They understood the value of holding ground. What they didn't understand, what their entire armored warfare doctrine prevented them from understanding, was that a vehicle didn't need to do any of those things if it could simply refuse to be there when German guns aimed at it. The hedgerows of Normandy provided the first test of whether American tank destroyer doctrine could translate theory into battlefield results. The dense bocage country, with its thick earthen walls topped by centuries-old hedges, created a nightmare for armored warfare. Visibility measured in dozens of yards rather than hundreds, every field was a potential ambush site. Every hedgerow concealed possible anti-tank positions. German defenders exploited this terrain brilliantly, positioning their tanks and anti-tank guns to cover the narrow gaps between hedgerows, creating kill zones where American armor had to advance through predictable choke points. If you find this story engaging, please take a moment to subscribe and enable notifications. It helps us continue producing in-depth content like this. Traditional American tactics struggled in this environment. Sherman tanks, advancing to support infantry, became easy targets. German tanks could wait in concealment until American armor committed to crossing a field, then destroy vehicles before they could reverse course. The Americans held numerical superiority, but the bocage negated that advantage by preventing the concentration of forces that American doctrine relied upon. The Hellcat changed these calculations fundamentally. Where Shermans had to commit to crossing open ground, Hellcats could race across at speeds that gave German gunners seconds rather than minutes to acquire targets. Where other American armor tried to hold captured ground, Hellcats fired from positions and vanished before German artillery could respond. Most importantly, the Hellcat's speed allowed it to exploit the one advantage American forces possessed in the bocage: interior lines of communication. American forces controlled the road network behind their front lines. German forces, constantly bombed by Allied aircraft, struggled to move reinforcements during daylight hours. This meant that if German armor appeared threatening one sector, American tank destroyer battalions could redeploy faster than German units could shift to exploit success elsewhere. The Hellcat's mobility transformed defensive operations from static holding actions into fluid battles of maneuver, where American forces could concentrate firepower at threatened points before German commanders realized what was happening. But the bocage fighting also revealed the Hellcat's vulnerabilities with brutal clarity. The open-top turret, in terrain where German infantry could approach within grenade range, became a severe liability. Crews reported instances where German soldiers positioned in upper floors of buildings could fire directly down into Hellcat fighting compartments. The thin armor that was acceptable when fighting at range became deadly when combat closed to dozens of yards. Several Hellcats were disabled not by German tanks, but by Panzer Faust rockets fired by German infantry, who infiltrated American positions. The tank destroyer battalions adapted, as combat units always do when doctrine meets reality. Hellcat platoons began working more closely with American infantry, who could screen the tank destroyers from close-range infantry attacks. Crews rigged camouflage netting and tarps to cover the open turrets when stationary, providing at least some protection from grenades and overhead fire. Some units welded additional armor plates around the turret ring, sacrificing a few miles per hour of top speed for protection against small arms fire. These adaptations occurred unit by unit, crew by crew, without guidance from higher headquarters. The Tank Destroyer Center at Fort Hood, Texas, continued teaching doctrine based on 1942 field manuals, emphasizing massed battalion-level operations against German armored breakthroughs that rarely materialized. Meanwhile, in France, tank destroyer battalions found themselves parceled out to infantry divisions, fighting not as mobile reserves but as direct fire support weapons, blasting German fortifications, and providing the high-velocity guns infantry commanders needed to reduce German strongpoints. This divergence between doctrine and practice created tension throughout the tank destroyer force. Some officers argued that the specialized training, the unique vehicles, the entire organizational structure of tank destroyer battalions was being wasted on infantry support missions that conventional tanks could perform. Others pointed out that regardless of what tank destroyer units were supposed to do, infantry commanders needed their firepower, and American soldiers were dying because they lacked weapons capable of destroying German fortifications at direct fire ranges. The debate became academic on September 19, 1944, when Lieutenant Leiper's platoon encountered German armor near Arracourt. The engagement vindicated everything tank destroyer doctrine promised, while simultaneously revealing why those promises so rarely materialized in combat. The conditions at Arracourt were nearly perfect for Hellcat operations. Open terrain with good sight lines, German armor advancing across that terrain without proper reconnaissance, American tank destroyers positioned to intercept with clear escape routes. Under these ideal circumstances, the results were spectacular. Company C, 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, supported by elements of the 4th Armored Division, engaged German forces from the 113th Panzer Brigade. Throughout September 19th and 20th, the Americans employed classic tank destroyer tactics. Hellcat platoons positioned in hull-down positions covering likely German approach routes. When German armor appeared, often in fog that reduced visibility, the Hellcats engaged at maximum effective range, fired until German forces began to respond, then displaced to alternate positions before German artillery could target them. By the time the battle concluded 3 days later, the 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion had destroyed 39 German tanks, including numerous Panthers, while losing only 4 Hellcats destroyed and 3 damaged. This represented exactly the kind of kill ratio that tank destroyer doctrine had promised. Fast-moving, lightly armored vehicles with powerful guns, properly employed, could devastate enemy armor while suffering minimal losses themselves. But Arracourt also revealed why such successes were rare. The engagement occurred because German forces attacked into prepared American positions across terrain that favored the defenders. American reconnaissance had identified German assembly areas, allowing tank destroyer units to position themselves advantageously before combat began. The Germans advanced without adequate reconnaissance, apparently believing American forces in the area were weaker than they actually were, and perhaps most critically, American air superiority prevented German forces from conducting aerial reconnaissance that would have revealed American positions. In other words, Arracourt represented tank destroyer doctrine working under near-optimal conditions. The question that would haunt American armored forces for the rest of the war was whether the doctrine could work when conditions weren't optimal, when German forces didn't cooperate by attacking into ambushes, when terrain didn't favor rapid movement, when fog and weather grounded American aircraft and eliminated the intelligence advantage that American forces relied upon. The answer came 2 months later in the frozen forests of the Ardennes. December 16, 1944, German forces launched Operation Wacht am Rhein, what American forces would come to know as the Battle of the Bulge. 24 German divisions, including 10 panzer divisions fielding 1,500 armoured vehicles, attacked through the Ardennes forest, targeting thinly held American positions. The objective was audacious: break through American lines, capture the port of Antwerp, split Allied forces, and force a negotiated peace in the West. For the first time since the Normandy landings, American forces found themselves on the defensive against a major German armoured offensive. This was the scenario that tank destroyer doctrine had been designed for: massed German armour attacking on narrow fronts. American tank destroyer battalions held in reserve, ready to rush to threatened sectors. Mobile warfare where speed and firepower could offset numerical disadvantages. If the doctrine was going to work, the Bulge should have been its finest hour. Reality proved more complex. Some tank destroyer battalions performed exactly as doctrine prescribed. The 705th Tank Destroyer Battalion, equipped with Hellcats, deployed to defend Neuville, a small town northeast of Bastogne. On December 19th and 20th, elements of the 705th, working alongside paratroopers from the 101st Airborne Division and tanks from the 10th Armoured Division, helped blunt attacks from the German 2nd Panzer Division. 4 Hellcats, properly positioned and aggressively employed, accounted for significant German armour losses, while the Americans held critical terrain. But other tank destroyer units struggled desperately. Battalions equipped with towed guns, unable to reposition quickly as German forces advanced, were simply overrun. The gun crews, exposed to small arms fire without the protection of armoured vehicles, and suffered devastating casualties. Even self-propelled tank destroyer battalions found the fluid, chaotic nature of the fighting difficult to handle. Tank destroyer doctrine assumed that American forces would have time to identify German thrusts, reposition reserves, and establish ambush positions. The Bulge's opening days featured German forces appearing where American intelligence said they couldn't be, advancing faster than American reserves could react, creating exactly the kind of chaos that defensive preparations couldn't contain. The Hellcat units that succeeded did so by abandoning much of their training and improvising desperately. Rather than waiting in reserve for orders to redeploy to threatened sectors, Hellcat platoons raced toward the sound of combat, often operating independently without clear intelligence about German positions or friendly unit locations. Rather than conducting deliberate reconnaissance to identify firing positions and escape routes, crews fought from whatever cover they could find, often holding positions longer than doctrine advised because retreating meant abandoning American infantry to German armour. The 704th Tank Destroyer Battalion, veterans of Arracourt, found themselves defending the town of Staumont against elements of the 1st SS Panzer Division. The engagement bore little resemblance to the carefully orchestrated ambushes at Arracourt. German forces attacked through narrow roads, limiting manoeuvre options. Fog and snow reduced visibility, making it difficult to identify targets at range. The close terrain meant that when Hellcats fired, their muzzle flashes immediately revealed their positions, inviting return fire from German tanks that were often mere hundreds of yards away. Yet the Hellcats continued to fight, and their speed continued to provide advantages even in this constrained environment. When German armour appeared, Hellcats could reposition faster than the German tanks could track them. When one firing position became untenable, Hellcats could withdraw and establish new positions, while German forces were still organising pursuit. The psychological impact on German crews was significant. They had expected to face American Shermans, which they knew how to fight. Instead, they encountered vehicles that appeared, fired, and vanished. Vehicles that seemed to be everywhere simultaneously. Vehicles that refused to stand and trade shots. A German tank commander from the 1st SS Panzer Division, captured after the battle, described the experience with frustration. His unit had encountered American armour throughout the advance, he explained. Sometimes they could identify the vehicles as Shermans and engage them with confidence, but other times they saw only muzzle flashes, took fire from unexpected angles, and by the time they had oriented their guns toward the threat, the enemy had vanished. His crew spent more time scanning for these ghost vehicles than actually firing at identified targets. The psychological effect, he admitted, was more damaging than the physical losses. His crew grew hesitant, expecting ambushes around every corner, slowing their advance even when resistance was light. This represented the Hellcat's greatest achievement, and it had nothing to do with kill ratios or vehicle specifications. The Hellcat forced German armored forces to fight cautiously, to advance slowly, to expect ambushes that might or might not exist. In a campaign where the German operational plan depended on rapid advances to capture fuel dumps before their own supplies ran out, forcing caution was as effective as destroying tanks. Every hour German forces spent reconnoitering carefully was an hour American reserves had to redeploy. An hour American engineers had to destroy bridges and fuel stocks, an hour closer to the moment when German momentum would stall entirely. By January 1945, when the Bulge fighting finally concluded, American tank destroyer battalions had proven both the strengths and limitations of their doctrine. Under ideal conditions, as at Arracourt, Hellcats could achieve remarkable results with minimal losses. Under desperate circumstances, as in the opening days of the Bulge, even the fastest tank destroyer couldn't be everywhere at once, couldn't substitute mobility for the armor protection and sustained firepower that defensive operations sometimes required. But in aggregate, across hundreds of engagements, the Hellcat units achieved kill ratios that vindicated the basic premise: speed and firepower, properly employed, could substitute for armor protection. The statistics tell part of the story. The M18 Hellcat achieved the highest kill-to-loss ratio of any American armored vehicle in World War II. Approximately 2.4 German armored vehicles destroyed for every Hellcat lost. Distinguished battalions like the 603rd and 704th each claimed more than 90 enemy armored fighting vehicle kills during the European campaign. These numbers represented real German tanks that didn't reach American infantry, real breakthroughs that never materialized, real crises that were averted. But statistics can't capture what it meant to crew a Hellcat in combat. Every other American armored fighting vehicle offered at least the possibility that its armor might protect you. A Sherman crew knew that against lighter German weapons, their frontal armor could deflect hits. An M10 Wolverine crew had thicker armor than a Hellcat. Even an M8 armored car, with only a quarter-inch of armor, at least provided the illusion of protection. A Hellcat crew had no such illusions. Half an inch of armor wouldn't stop a 75mm shell. It wouldn't stop an 88mm round. Against German tank guns, against Panzerfaust rockets, against heavy machine gun fire at close range, the Hellcat's armor was effectively decorative. Crew survival depended entirely on not being where German weapons were aimed when they fired. That meant being faster than the enemy, smarter than the enemy, more aggressive than the enemy, every single time. There was no margin for error, there were no second chances. The psychological toll of this constant vulnerability manifested in different ways among different crews. Some found it liberating, the ultimate test of skill and nerve. These crews embraced the Hellcat's philosophy completely, taking pride in their ability to outthink and outmaneuver German armor. They developed an almost cocky confidence, knowing that in their Hellcats they possessed capabilities no German tank could match. Speed became intoxicating, the rush of racing across open ground at 50 miles per hour, while German shells fell behind them, the satisfaction of destroying an enemy tank and vanishing before return fire arrived. Other crews found the constant vulnerability unbearable. They saw friends in other Hellcats brew up from single hits, watched as vehicles that moments ago had contained living crews became burning pyres. They understood intellectually that their speed provided protection, but intellectual understanding doesn't calm the primitive fear that comes from knowing a single German shell means instant death. Some of these crews requested transfers to Sherman units or M10 battalions, accepting slower vehicles in exchange for thicker armor. Others simply endured, day after day, fighting despite fear because that's what the mission required. The doctrine placed similar psychological pressure on commanders. A tank battalion commander, ordering Shermans into combat, knew that his tanks could absorb some punishment, could hold ground if necessary, could trade losses for territorial gains. A tank destroyer battalion commander ordering Hellcats forward accepted that any mistake in timing, any error in positioning, any failure of reconnaissance could result in catastrophic losses. The margin between success and disaster was measured in seconds and yards, not minutes and miles. This pressure led to the best and worst of American military leadership manifesting in tank destroyer units. The best commanders empowered their subordinates, understanding that doctrine emphasizing speed and initiative required crews and platoon leaders to make decisions without waiting for orders. These commanders provided clear objectives, ensured their units had accurate intelligence, then trusted their subordinates to execute missions using their judgment. The results could be spectacular, as crews who understood the terrain and enemy dispositions better than any distant headquarters exploited opportunities as they emerged. The worst commanders tried to micromanage operations from battalion headquarters, issuing detailed orders that were obsolete by the time subordinate units received them. Tank destroyer tactics required flexibility and rapid decision-making. Commanders who couldn't accept this, who insisted on controlling every movement and engagement, negated the very advantages that made Hellcats effective. Their units suffered disproportionate casualties as crews followed outdated orders into situations their eyes told them were suicidal. Script continues. As the war ground toward its conclusion in the spring of 1945, the role of tank destroyer battalions shifted dramatically. German armored forces, decimated by years of attrition, no longer possessed the strength to launch the massed tank offensives that American doctrine had been designed to counter. Individual German tanks still posed threats, and German anti-tank guns remained deadly. But the days of panzer divisions racing across the countryside were over. German forces fought defensive battles now, holding terrain, defending cities, trying to delay the inevitable rather than achieving decisive victories. In this environment, the specialized nature of tank destroyer battalions became problematic. Their vehicles were optimized for mobile warfare against enemy armor. But American forces in 1945 needed vehicles that could support infantry assaults on German fortifications, that could hold captured ground against counterattacks, that could operate in close terrain, where speed provided minimal advantage. The 76mm guns on Hellcats and M10s, while adequate for penetrating armor, lacked the high explosive performance needed to reduce fortifications effectively. The thin armor that was acceptable when fighting at range became deadly when German anti-tank guns could be concealed in rubble at close range. Tank destroyer units adapted, because that's what combat units do, but their vehicles' limitations became increasingly apparent. Hellcat crews found themselves providing overwatch for Sherman advances rather than conducting independent operations. They supported infantry attacks by engaging German strong points from distance, though their guns were poorly suited for this mission. They conducted reconnaissance operations, using their speed to probe German defenses, though their lack of armor made this role increasingly hazardous. The 630th Tank Destroyer Battalion, one of the first Hellcat units and among the most successful, summed up the situation in an after-action report from March 1945. The battalion had achieved impressive kill ratios throughout the European campaign, but by spring 1945, they reported, their primary missions had little to do with destroying enemy tanks. They were providing direct fire support for infantry, engaging German anti-tank guns and fortifications, screening flanks during advances. Missions for which, the report noted carefully, a Sherman tank would have been better suited given its thicker armor and better high-explosive ammunition. This wasn't a criticism of the Hellcat as a vehicle. It was an acknowledgement that the battlefield had changed, and specialized vehicles designed for specific missions became less useful when those missions no longer dominated operations. The Hellcat had been designed to fight the kind of war Germany waged in 1940 and 1941. By 1945, Germany was fighting a different war entirely, and the conditions that made Hellcats effective had largely disappeared. Yet the impact of tank destroyer doctrine extended far beyond the statistics and after-action reports. The psychological warfare aspect, the way Hellcats forced German armor to fight cautiously, had effects that rippled through the entire German defensive system. German tank commanders in 1944 and 1945 didn't know which American vehicles they would face in any given engagement. Sometimes it would be Shermans, which they knew how to fight. Sometimes it would be Hellcats, which required completely different tactics. Sometimes it would be M36 Jacksons, mounting 90mm guns that could penetrate Tiger armor from the front. This uncertainty forced German forces to prepare for worst-case scenarios. They had to assume every American armored vehicle might be a fast-moving tank destroyer capable of appearing from unexpected angles. They had to position their armor defensively, ready to respond to threats from multiple directions, rather than concentrating it for offensive operations. They had to advance cautiously, reconnoitering carefully, because the alternative was driving into ambushes from vehicles that could destroy them before they could respond. The German response to American tank destroyer tactics revealed the fundamental asymmetry of the situation. German forces, operating on the defensive with declining resources, couldn't afford to lose tanks to clever American ambushes. Each German tank destroyed was irreplaceable, and each German tank lost meant one fewer vehicle available to stop the next American advance. American forces, advancing with overwhelming numerical superiority and complete air dominance, could afford to trade multiple Shermans for a single Tiger because replacements would arrive within days. But they preferred not to make those trades if Hellcat tactics could destroy German armor at more favorable ratios. This placed German tank crews in an impossible psychological situation. They knew, from intelligence reports and captured documents, that American tank destroyers had thin armor and couldn't survive direct hits. But they also knew that by the time they identified and engaged a Hellcat, it would probably have already fired and displaced. German training emphasized aggressive tactics, closing with the enemy, using superior armor and firepower to dominate engagements. American tank destroyer tactics made aggressive movement suicidal. German tank commanders who advanced boldly found themselves engaged from multiple directions by vehicles they hadn't seen before being fired upon. The result was a kind of tactical paralysis. German armor that should have been conducting counterattacks to disrupt American advances instead held defensive positions, waiting for American forces to come to them. When German armor did attack, it moved cautiously, carefully, slowly. Exactly the opposite of the tempo that had made German armored forces so effective in 1940 and 1941. The Hellcat didn't break German tank crews' will to fight, but it broke their confidence that aggressive action would succeed. By May 8, 1945, when Germany surrendered, more than 2,000 M18 Hellcats had seen combat across Europe and the Pacific. They had destroyed thousands of German and Japanese armored vehicles, blunted dozens of armored attacks, enabled American advances through their aggressive reconnaissance and flanking operations. Distinguished battalions had compiled records that stood among the most impressive of any American armored units. Yet within 5 years of the war's end, the US Army deactivated all tank destroyer battalions and retired the Hellcat from service. The vehicle that had achieved the highest kill ratio of the war was deemed obsolete. The doctrine that had guided the creation of an entire branch of the army was abandoned. Tank destroyer units were disbanded, their personnel reassigned to tank or artillery battalions, their unique mission eliminated entirely. Thank you for watching. For more detailed historical breakdowns, check out the other videos on your screen now, and don't forget to subscribe.